1979 was a strange year for horror. The old grindhouse era was fading, the slasher boom hadn't quite begun, and filmmakers around the world were experimenting with tone, style, and pure insanity. It was a crossroads, where art met exploitation, and where the line between serious cinema and drive-in shock started to blur. These weren't polished studio horrors or neatly packaged franchises. They were grim, weird, and often unpredictable. You'd find them buried in the back shelves of a video store or running late at night on some half-forgotten cable channel. This was the year of haunted highways, killer animals, cursed faith, and madness behind every door. A year when horror didn't know what it wanted to be. And because of that, it became something unforgettable. So get comfortable, hit play on that dusty rental, and step back into 1979. A year where horror was raw, restless, and wonderfully unhinged. The Driller Killer, 1979. Few horror films capture the raw, filthy energy of late 70s New York quite like The Driller Killer. Released in 1979, it's part art film, part urban nightmare, and all frustration. It's not just a slasher. It's a portrait of a city and a man coming apart at the seams. The story follows a struggling painter trying to survive in a crumbling apartment, while noise, poverty, and desperation close in around him. His life unravels piece by piece until he finally snaps, wandering through the streets at night with a power drill, turning his rage on anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. Director Abel Ferrara, who also plays the lead, filmed it guerrilla style on the streets of Manhattan, giving it a gritty realism that feels more documentary than fiction. You can almost smell the garbage and hear the city's endless hum underneath every scene. It's not stylish or slick. It's raw, chaotic, and completely grounded in the ugliness of the real world. What makes The Driller Killer stand out isn't just the violence. It's the atmosphere. It captures a moment in time when New York felt like it was rotting from the inside out, and Ferrara treats the killer's breakdown like a symptom of the city itself. There's no glamour here, no cool killer persona, just exhaustion and decay. When it hit home video in the early 80s, The Driller Killer became infamous, one of the titles that helped define the video nasty era in the UK. But behind that reputation is something more interesting. A grimy, desperate reflection of urban isolation. It's a movie that gets under your skin, not because of what it shows, but because of how real it feels. A slasher that's less about the drill and more about what's driving it. The Traveler, 1979, Spain's The Traveler, also known as El Caminante, or The Devil Incarnate, is one of the strangest and most overlooked films of the 1970s, a dark fable that feels part morality tale, part nightmare, and part road movie through hell itself. Released in 1979 and directed by Paul Naschy, it's a film that takes the shape of an allegory but carries the soul of a grindhouse fever dream. Naschy, best known for his werewolf films, plays the devil in human form, wandering the countryside in the 17th century. He's charming, cunning, and quietly cruel, corrupting every person he meets: beggars, merchants, priests, even the desperate and the innocent. Each encounter becomes a twisted parable about greed, lust, and hypocrisy. But as his journey continues, even the devil starts to feel the weight of what he's created. What makes The Traveler so fascinating is its tone. It shifts constantly between grotesque humor, tragedy, and pure surrealism. There's nudity, blasphemy, and moral decay, but also a strange sense of melancholy running through it all. The rural setting filled with dust and ruin gives it the feel of a world already abandoned by God. It's not a film of clean storytelling or traditional horror beats. Instead, it plays like a series of vivid, unholy vignettes, a journey through sin and suffering where every soul is already lost. When it eventually surfaced on home video, The Traveler was embraced by fans of Naschy's darker, more personal work. It's less about monsters and more about humanity at its worst, told through the eyes of the one being who understands it all too well. The Traveler is grim, strange, and completely unlike anything else from the period, a walk through damnation that never feels far from the truth. Prophecy, 1979. Prophecy is what happens when a big studio tries to make an environmental message movie and accidentally creates one of the strangest creature features of the 1970s. Released by Paramount in 1979, it's a mix of serious eco-horror, pulp sci-fi, and unintentional comedy that's somehow become a cult classic. The story follows a doctor and his wife sent to rural Maine to investigate pollution from a paper mill. The toxic runoff is poisoning the land and the local wildlife, but the real horror is what it's doing to the forest itself. Something enormous and horribly mutated is lurking in the woods, a creature born from mercury and revenge. The film tries to balance environmental drama with monster mayhem, but those tones collide in spectacular ways. It's beautifully shot, misty forests, wide rivers, and haunting landscapes. But then the mutant bear shows up, and all sense of restraint goes out the window. The creature design is unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. Lumpy, hairless, and shrieking, like a nightmare someone stitched together from a biology textbook. What saves Prophecy from being just another monster movie is how sincerely it takes itself. It's trying to say something meaningful about pollution, exploitation, and the arrogance of humanity. But it's delivered through a rubber monster that mauls campers in sleeping bags. The result is bizarrely entertaining, a perfect balance of message and madness. When it hit home video, Prophecy found a second life, as one of those you've-got-to-see-this movies. Not because it's great, but because it's too weird to ignore. It's earnest, overblown, and completely unforgettable. Prophecy proves that even when Hollywood aims for serious commentary, sometimes the monster steals the message. And that's what makes it perfect. Beyond the Darkness, 1979. Italy's Beyond the Darkness is one of those horror films that feels like it shouldn't exist. A mix of melodrama, decay, and raw shock value that pushes even the most jaded horror fan to the edge. Released in 1979 and directed by Joe D'Amato, it's both disgusting and oddly beautiful. A film that turns grief into obsession and obsession into rot. The story centers on a man named Frank, who becomes unhinged after the death of his girlfriend. Unable to let her go, he digs up her corpse, preserves it in his home, and tries to carry on life as normal. But as his sanity collapses, his house becomes a tomb, filled with blood, embalming fluid, and madness. D'Amato shoots it all with uncomfortable intimacy, bright lighting, long takes, and close-ups that don't flinch. There's a sense of domestic calm that makes the violence even harder to watch. It's not a movie about monsters. It's about loneliness so deep it rots from the inside out. The score by Goblin gives it a strange elegance, and that clash, beautiful music over horrifying imagery, makes Beyond the Darkness feel more tragic than exploitative. By the time it made its way onto home video, it had already built a reputation as one of the most disturbing Italian horror films of the decade. It's not for everyone, but for those who can handle it, Beyond the Darkness is unforgettable. A grim reflection on grief, death, and what happens when love refuses to die. Savage Weekend, 1979. Savage Weekend is a strange one. A movie that feels like a slasher, a soap opera, and a grim exploitation film all at once. Shot in the mid-70s but released in 1979, it landed right before the slasher boom exploded, making it one of those transitional horror oddities that doesn't quite fit into any box. The story follows a group of friends from the city heading to a rural town for a weekend getaway. But the trip quickly turns sour. Local hostility brews. Secrets come out, and someone starts stalking them from behind a grotesque mask. What begins as a romantic drama turns into something far more violent. What's interesting about Savage Weekend is how disjointed it feels. But that disjointedness works in its favor. It's slow, talky, and filled with tension that never quite pays off in the way you expect. The film spends a surprising amount of time exploring the relationships between the characters, only to twist that intimacy into paranoia and fear. There's a rough, unpolished quality to the whole production that makes it feel genuine, like you're watching something real slowly fall apart. It's shot with a gritty, handheld energy, full of natural light and long silences that make the violence hit even harder when it comes. When it eventually made its way to home video, Savage Weekend found its audience, among fans of early slashers and regional horror. People who appreciate the awkward, unpredictable tone that came before the formula set in. It's not slick, it's not consistent, but that's the charm. Savage Weekend feels like a forgotten relic from the moment right before horror figured out what it was going to be. Messy, human, and unnervingly real. Fascination, 1979. Jane Rollin's Fascination is one of the most striking and dreamlike horror films of the late 70s, a gothic fever dream drenched in elegance, blood, and surreal eroticism. Released in 1979, it perfectly captures Rollin's signature blend of sensuality and decay, where beauty and death always seem to exist side by side. The story begins with a thief on the run who takes refuge in an isolated chateau, only to discover it's inhabited by two mysterious women. They welcome him in, but their charm hides something sinister. As the night unfolds, the lines between hunter and prey blur, and what starts as seduction quickly turns into something far darker. Like most of Rollin's work, Fascination moves at its own pace, slow, hypnotic, and full of quiet menace. The chateau itself becomes a character filled with mirrors, long corridors, and a sense that time doesn't quite work the same way inside its walls. The film's imagery is unforgettable. Black capes fluttering across open fields, scythes glinting in the sun, and crimson blood staining marble floors. There's little dialogue and even less logic, but that's part of its power. Rollin doesn't want you to understand Fascination. He wants you to fall under its spell. It's equal parts art film and horror movie, sensual and sinister in the same breath. When it found new life on home video, Fascination became one of Rollin's most celebrated works, not for its story, but for how it feels. It's the kind of film that haunts you, not because of what happens, but because of how it lingers. A slow, beautiful nightmare that never quite ends. Don't Go in the House, 1979. Don't Go in the House is one of the darkest and most uncomfortable American horror films to come out of the late 1970s. Released in 1979, it was part of the early wave of psycho killer movies, inspired by Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it pushes even further into the disturbing psychology of isolation and abuse. The film centers on Donnie Kohler, a lonely man who grew up under the control of an abusive mother who burned him as punishment. When she dies, Donnie's mind unravels. He builds a steel-lined room in his house, soundproofed and sealed, where he begins bringing home women to reenact the trauma he can't escape. It's a setup that's both horrifying and strangely sad, the portrait of someone completely hollowed out by childhood pain. What sets Don't Go in the House apart from other late 70s exploitation films is its tone. It's quiet, bleak, and almost clinical in how it observes Donnie's breakdown. There's no joy in the violence, no release, just dread. The sterile lighting and cold industrial spaces make the entire film feel detached, like watching a nightmare from behind glass. When it hit home video, it quickly became notorious for its most graphic scene, one that got it banned or heavily cut in several countries. But even stripped of shock value, it remains deeply unsettling. Don't Go in the House is horror stripped to its bones. No glamour, no charm, just human damage laid bare. It's not a fun watch, but it's one that sticks with you, long after the credits fade. Nightwing, 1979. Nightwing is one of those late 70s studio horror films that tried to mix social commentary with creature thrills, and ended up creating something strangely unique. Released in 1979, it's a blend of ecological horror, Native American mysticism, and small-town paranoia, with killer vampire bats thrown in for good measure. The story is set in a remote desert community in New Mexico, where cattle are dying mysteriously, and the locals are divided between superstition and science. A local tribal deputy begins investigating, uncovering a terrifying truth. A swarm of rabid vampire bats infected by an ancient curse is heading straight for the town. What follows is part monster movie, part spiritual reckoning. Director Arthur Hiller treats the material seriously, almost too seriously, filling the film with sweeping desert landscapes, ritual symbolism, and slow-burn tension. But when the bats attack, all that restraint vanishes in a flurry of shrieks, blood, and chaos. It's a strange tonal clash that somehow works, creating a mood that's both grand and grimy at the same time. Unlike most animal attack movies of its era, Nightwing isn't really about the creatures. It's about people trying to hold on to their beliefs in a world that's changing around them. The clash between modernity and tradition runs through every scene, turning a pulp premise into something unexpectedly thoughtful. When it eventually hit home video, Nightwing found an audience among fans of slow-burn horror and eco-thrillers like Prophecy in the Pack. It's moody, uneven, and often overlooked, but it captures a kind of quiet, end-of-the-decade dread that feels very specific to 1979. Nightwing may have been marketed as a monster movie, but beneath the shrieking bats and desert dust is a story about fear, faith, and the uneasy balance between nature and man. Tourist Trap, 1979. Tourist Trap is one of the great underappreciated horror films of the late 1970s. A strange, surreal blend of slasher terror, supernatural horror, and pure nightmare logic. Released in 1979, it feels like a dream you might have rented by accident. Familiar at first, but getting stranger with every scene until you can't quite believe what you're watching. The story follows a group of friends stranded on a lonely stretch of highway after their car breaks down. They stumble upon a rundown roadside attraction, a wax museum filled with eerie mannequins, and meet the friendly but unsettling owner, Mr. Slauson. From there, the film takes a hard turn into madness as the mannequins start to move on their own, and something unseen begins picking off the visitors one by one. Director David Schmoller, in his debut, brings a dreamlike atmosphere that sets Tourist Trap apart from other late 70s slashers. The sound design alone is enough to get under your skin. The creaking mannequins, the warped voices, and the haunting score by Pino Donaggio, who also worked on Carrie and Don't Look Now. Everything feels slightly off, like reality is bending just out of sight. What makes it special is how unpredictable it is. It shifts from creepy to tragic to downright bizarre, all while keeping a strange emotional core. Chuck Connors' performance as Slauson is both sympathetic and terrifying. A lonely man surrounded by his family of lifeless figures, drifting further into delusion. When Tourist Trap hit home video, it became a word-of-mouth favorite, the kind of movie people would stumble across late at night and never forget. It's eerie, imaginative, and way more artistic than its title suggests. Tourist Trap is pure nightmare fuel, a surreal roadside detour into the uncanny, where the mannequins never stop watching, and escape feels like another illusion. The Killer Nun, 1979. The Killer Nun is one of those movies that could only have come out of Italy in the late 70s. A mix of religious guilt, psychological breakdown, and lurid exploitation that somehow manages to feel both shocking and sincere. Released in 1979 and directed by Giulio Berruti, it sits right at the intersection of art house melodrama and grindhouse scandal. The film follows Sister Gertrude, a nun recovering from brain surgery, who begins to spiral into madness. Her faith unravels, her behavior becomes erratic, and soon she's lashing out in increasingly violent and immoral ways. The convent around her turns into a maze of repression and desire, where prayer, addiction, and murder start to blend together. Anita Ekberg gives the film its strange gravity. Her performance walks a tightrope between tragic and unhinged, turning what could have been pure exploitation into something oddly sympathetic. You feel the sickness, the confusion, and the slow moral decay creeping into every scene. Like much of Italy's nunsploitation wave, The Killer Nun uses shock to explore themes the church would rather avoid: hypocrisy, temptation, and the human weakness beneath devotion. The cinematography is clinical and detached, full of sterile corridors and cold light that make the violence feel even more disturbing. It's easy to dismiss a title like The Killer Nun as trash, but there's more going on under the surface. It's about control, guilt, and what happens when the institutions meant to save us are the ones that break us. When it arrived on home video in the 80s, it became infamous, banned in several countries, and lumped in with the video nasties. But over time, it's gained recognition as one of the smarter, moodier entries in the genre. A film that shocks you first, then leaves you thinking afterward. The Killer Nun isn't subtle, but it's unforgettable. A strange collision of faith and madness that could only have been born in 1979 Italy. Looking back, 1979 feels like the last gasp of an era. The end of the rough, experimental horror of the 70s, right before the sleek, blood-soaked 1980s took over. It was a year of transition, when every new release felt like a gamble. Sometimes brilliant, sometimes broken, but always interesting. These films weren't made to be perfect. They were made to stick with you. From the driller killer's City Decay to Tourist Trap's Surreal Nightmare, every one of them captured a different shade of dread. Together, they mark a moment when horror was still finding itself, unpredictable, creative, and completely unfiltered. So if you ever stumble across a worn tape from 1979, don't skip it. Those rough edges and strange tones are part of what makes it special. Thanks for watching, and remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.